present day, pretty much until it was written. And in there, he explains how the Jews, not only that we were here first at biblical time, we all know the biblical stories, and it's not just stories of the Bible. I mean, everywhere you dig inside Israel and in the West Bank, archaeologic diggings, you find Jewish relics and archaeology foundings from 3,000 years ago, from 2,000 years ago. You cannot make up archaeological finds. But also in modern times, we were first. In the 19th century, when the first Jewish pilgrims came from Europe into the land of Israel, the land was empty and desolate. It was an insignificant part of the Turkish Empire. And you have the famous American author Mark Twain that visited the Holy Land in the middle of the 19th century. And he wrote a book about his travel to the Holy Land. And in his book, he describes a completely empty and desolate land with hardly anybody living there. And that was in the middle of the 19th century. And then when the first Jews came and, started building their communities that were flourishing, and then the British came over and started developing the land as well in the early 20th century. So, all the Middle East was part of the British Empire pretty much. So there was no borders. And then Arabs from neighboring countries such as Egypt, such as Syria, such as Jordan started to immigrate as, labor immigrants to work for the British and for the Jewish communities. And so it wasn't that long ago. It was about 100 years ago. And you can see that in their last names of the Palestinians, there's still the most common last name of the Palestinians is El Masri, which means Egyptian in Arabic, or Khalabi, which means Khalaf or Aleppo in Syria, or Hijazi, which is an area in Saudi Arabia. So they don't really hide it themselves. And they started referring to themselves only as Palestinians only in 1964, when the PLO was created. Before that, not a single Arab ever identified himself as Palestinian. Only the Jews were identifying themselves as Palestinians, at the time of the British mandate of Palestine in the early 20th century. My grandma said that she was calling herself Palestinian when she was a teenager, in Palestine. So, and the word Palestine has nothing to do with Arabs. The word Palestine comes from the Roman name after there was a great revolt of the Jews in 120 AD, Bar Kokhba revolt, if some of you might be aware of. We still celebrate something that got a holiday that got to do with Bar Kokhba. It's called Lag BaOmer, in Israel at least. You do it with big bonfires, etc. So, but this rebellion failed. And then when the Romans, part of their punishment for the Jews was to change the name of the province from province of Judea to province of Palestine. And they named it after the ancient Philistines from the time of the Bible, that were Greek people. It has nothing to do with the current Palestinians. That, even today, in Arabic, you don't have the letter P. The Palestinians themselves cannot pronounce the word Palestine because it has nothing to do with Arabic. It's a Roman Greek word, so.
Now, the Palestinians, whether they are the indigenous population or not, the realities on the ground is that we have a Palestinian agenda of people that want to have rights for self-determination. And if you can tell us a little bit about the Palestinian narrative of what they call the El Nakba, the resulting refugee problem. According to the Palestinians, there are now 7.25 million refugees. And is it even possible to solve the refugee problem without overwhelming the state of Israel by overpopulating it with Palestinian refugees? I mean, if all 7.25 million Palestinian refugees are able to exercise their right of return, what will happen to the state of Israel? So two things, the El Nakba narrative and the refugee problem. Go ahead.
So first of all, they're not wanting their own state. They want to ruin the Jewish state. If they would want only their own state, there would have come a solution long before. They were, 100% of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank and Gaza were in Arab hands before 1967. They didn't create their own Palestinian state. They didn't even claim to be a different people. They were just, the West Bank was part of Jordan and Gaza was part of Egypt, and they never even gave the idea of creating their own state. What the UN is calling Palestinian refugees is even the grandsons of people that immigrated from Palestine 100 years ago. So if there are Palestinian refugees, it means that I'm a Polish refugee because my grandfather, immigrated to Israel from Poland. This is the only group of population in the world that the refugee status inherited through to the children and grandchildren and grandchildren. In any other circumstances, any other nation, any other people, you can be only refugee if you physically yourself been displaced from a specific place, not if your grandchildren, So this is completely absurd. And the only reason that the UN keeps us, you got in the UN one agency for the refugees all over the world, whether it's from, war-torn countries like Syria, Myanmar, Sudan, millions and millions of refugees from all over the world that's been displaced and genocide right now, as we're speaking. And then one agency only for the Palestinian refugees that are not refugees for the last 100 years. So, it's absurd. And the only reason they keep calling their grandchildren as refugees is because they want to have the claim for them to come back to Israel, to Tel Aviv and to Haifa and to Jerusalem, to destroy Israel. Obviously, if the Jews will become a minority in Israel, so Israel will become just another Arab Muslim, failed state. So that's the point. That's the only point of that. But I'm pretty optimistic because you got, the Palestinians are not a real people, as we said from before. They're just a mixture of, Arab refugees from 100 years ago. And the reason the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict, which is tiny and completely insignificant, not only in the world stage but also in the Middle East, you got only since 2011. You got 500,000 people killed in the civil war in Syria. That had nothing to do with Israel. In the war between Iran and Iraq in the 80s, you got 1 million people killed on both sides. It had nothing to do with Israel. So the only reason this insignificant conflict was important is because all of the 22 Arab countries in the world that have all of the oil were behind this, this Palestinian demand to destroy Israel and destroy the Jewish people. And now you see a big change in the Arab world. We see the peace accords that Tila was there too. I was happy to see her from far away. And there's a big change, the more and more Arab countries and more Arab people starting to see Israel as an ally rather than a foe, and starting to see the Palestinians as, they're not their friends. They're just taking their money and then insulting their kings and insulting their, their flag, etc. We see the burning of flags of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Temple Mount. So they're starting to think to themselves, well, the Palestinians are siding with Iran, that is the biggest enemy for our country, for our people, for our Arab identity. And it's not Sunni, by the way, it's Shia. And then Israel is on our side. So why do we still need to support them? So I'm optimistic that, change will once more and more of the Muslim world will neglect the desire to destroy Israel. So, the conflict will be resolved on its own.
So you mentioned the conflict, and given the fact that the conflict is in Israel and it borders on some of our cities, you hear a lot people saying even if Israel has a legitimate right, and it does have a legitimate right to defend itself against rocket attacks from Gaza and from other places, doesn't the disproportionate death toll of Palestinians, doesn't that indicate that the response is, again, disproportionate on the part of Israel? How can Israel claim it's not waging war against the people of Gaza when so many civilians are being killed? What do we say to people who tell us, look at the numbers. You have, I'm just throwing a number, 20 Israelis dead, and you have 200 Palestinians. So what do we tell people when we see that no balance of death toll?
Well, first of all, the majority of the Palestinian casualties, for example, in Gaza, it's because they're firing rockets from densely populated area, from inside schools, from inside hospitals, from inside mosques. Usually the Israeli army, when they see them firing from civilian places, sometimes they're not even firing back, although they know that the missiles are going to pour down on Israeli cities. And when you're talking about disproportionate. The reason there's not a lot of Israelis, for example, being killed by these missiles is because we have the Iron Dome system. It's not because they don't want to kill, it's just because we protect ourselves technologically on our side, and they're firing the rockets from inside their own civilians in purpose for Israel to retaliate, and they want their own civilians to be killed. And when Americans say that, just think to yourself, what would happen to Cuba if Cuba would send missiles to Miami? How many Cubans would have get killed? Probably not a lot of Cubans would have stayed alive, right? If Cuba would have fired missiles on a daily basis on Miami or New York, right? So, think about the proportion of the American response to Cuba, sending missiles from inside Havana to Miami, and then compare it to what Israel do when all of its cities are being bombarded by missiles from Gaza. So.
You mentioned Iran, and that is really the elephant in the room right now, because Iran is nuclear ambitious. It is a dominating and destabilizing force in the Middle East. Does Iran really pose an existential threat to Israel? I mean, let's talk for real. Israel is the eighth superpower of the world. Israel itself has nuclear, even if it doesn't admit that it has. We know Israel has nuclear power. Israel has very advanced technology and weaponry. And does Iran really pose an existential threat? I know it poses a threat, but does it pose an existential threat, the likes of which we see Prime Minister Netanyahu, your father, a rally when he goes and speaks around the world? Go ahead.
So you need to remember that Israel is roughly in the size of Miami County, right? So you don't need a lot of nukes for, to take care of. And, this country, if it will ever get nukes, it's completely dangerous because they won't be afraid to use it because they're not rational. They won't think of the consequences like you had the balance of between the Soviet Union and the United States there, because both the Soviet Union and the United States were rational not to use nuclears on each other, and Iran is not rational in this way. It's a messianic
so you're saying there's no zero-sum game with Israel? There's not going to be a zero-sum game like the Cold War with Russia. It's going to be a unilateral.
And it's not and it's not a problem of Israel. They would, they would use this against all the Arab countries that it's, their prime enemies as well. And they're building ICV, intercontinental missiles that could reach the east coast of the United States. Why did they need to build intercontinental missiles if Israel is way in the range of their missiles? Why do they still need to keep enlarging the missiles all the way to cross the Atlantic? The only reason is to hit the United States, or at least to be capable of threatening the east coast of the United States. So, it's a problem for Europe, for Israel, for the Arabs, definitely, and for the United States. It's a global threat of a rogue state that don't adhere to international norms, to international laws, that, is not afraid to, is not a rational player. So, it's very dangerous.
We hear a lot of people saying anti-Zionistic slogans. And, some people claim that anti-Zionism is the new modern form of anti-Semitism. Is it true that every anti-Zionist remark is automatically an anti-Semitic remark? Or is it possible to be anti-Israel, point to Israel's faults? Israel is not a perfect country. When we criticize Israel, most of us that love Israel criticize it constructively. Could there be a person who's an anti-Zionist but not an anti-Semite? Or is it automatic? If you're an anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite?
Yeah. I'll explain why. Yes, I agree with this. Because if you are anti-Zionist, you're not criticizing a specific policy of Israel. You're criticizing the very right to Israel to exist. And if you say that every nation on earth has the right for their own country, except the Jewish people, and if you're, singling out the Jewish people with norms that no other country on earth is you judge to, so it is anti-Semitism. It's singling out Jewish Jews, singling out. It's denying their right for their own state, like any nation on earth has. And yeah, as of course, this is just a politically correct way to be anti-Semite, because old-fashioned anti-Semitism is kind of, out of fashion our days. So you cannot confess, just, the Jews need to be exterminated and stuff like that. You need to say, oh, Israel need to be exterminated. So this is not anti-Semitic, and you can be a respected professor in Harvard or Berkeley and be completely anti-Semitic and just disguise it as a woke way to
which really brings me to the next question. Distinguished professors at Harvard, Berkeley, NYU, Columbia, and other Ivy League schools, you have Jewish professors. You have people like Noam Chomsky. Now, Noam Chomsky is a very celebrated academic. He has more than 50 doctorate degrees from every university in the world. You have a person like Avi Shlaim, who served in the IDF. He's now at Oxford University, saying that Israel is a greater obstacle to peace than Hamas. You have people like David Sand, who is on a tenure in Tel Aviv University. He has a tenure at Tel Aviv University. He's getting paid by the university, and he slanders Israel. You have people like Norman Finkelstein. These are all Jewish academics, top-tier academics, and yet they are spewing hatred and hostility against their own kind. How do we understand the phenomenon of self-hating Jews? Yair, go ahead.
Are you surprised? I think it's one of the most known Jewish characteristic. What can you do? You always had the biggest enemies of the Jewish people were a lot of times were part of the Jewish people as well. You got George Soros, for example, is a Jewish billionaire and an American that's, dedicates his life for the destruction of Israel, for the destruction of America, for the destruction of Europe, for the destruction of all Western civilization. He spends billions of dollars for radical communist NGOs in America, in Israel, that are dedicated for the goal of bringing down those countries. So, it's hardly surprising. It's very unfortunate, but it's not surprising, especially in the academia. You're asking about American Jewish professors, but you got Israeli Jewish professors, most of them in the Israeli universities, that are just as bad and are just as anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish, Israeli, and they're getting paid by the Israeli government.
I think what's really surprising is that if you think about South Africa, I don't think there was one black South African. It's like saying that the black South Africans would be pro-apartheid. It boggles the mind to see that the Jewish people, professors, academics, intelligent people, sensible, reasonable people in the United States and in Israel, like you mentioned, would be anti-Zionist or self-hating Jews. I guess we have to live with that phenomenon. As you said, it's as old as time itself. We have biblical figures like Datan and Aviram, and we have Korach, and we had a whole list of people who stood up against the leadership. And I guess it's part of that particular territory that we are in. I'm going to move you along to the next question, and that is, if you can explain to all of us here listening on Zoom the concept of a two-state solution, what it is, and how is it going to work? What is the exact understanding? How do we understand and explain the two-state solution?
Well, when most liberals in America and progressives in America and Europe and Israel, when they're saying the two-state solution, what they have in mind is, first of all, Israel, together with the West Bank, together with Gaza, it's roughly the size of Miami County. So their vision is that half of it will become another Arab Muslim country, completely clean, ethnically cleansed from Jews. And then the rest of what will be left of Israel, which is roughly the size of Rhode Island, that won't be a Jewish state, that will be binational or, Jewish Arab, state that has no specific identity, that has, not a Jewish character. So this is what they have in mind. They won't say it out loud, but when you ask them, so what is your vision, and go to the specific, this is pretty much what they're saying. So, you know,
And what is
it's nice
Israel's
words
vision?
for,
What's Israel's vision of a two-state solution? I mean, I remember your father, Bibi, in Bar Ilan University speech had mentioned and kept on mentioning the two-state solution. What is Bibi Netanyahu's understanding of a two-state solution?
well, so you ask about Israel, so you have a lot of, sadly, the liberals, the left in Israel think the same as I said before. This is their vision for two-state solution. For the conservatives in Israel, at least, it means that, you know, that we cannot put our own faith in our own faith and our own very survival on the hands of anybody else. Definitely not a Palestinian police or army over there, but not any other foreign country. We saw how much, you know, the UN had uh, after the war with Lebanon in 2006, the UN got all the South Lebanon mandate to protect Israel from Hezbollah and make sure that Hezbollah is not entrenching itself in South Lebanon close to the Israeli border and not building missile facilities, etc., etc. And of course, it didn't happen. You know, Hezbollah is a terror organization, do whatever they want in the South Lebanese South Lebanese area, up until to the very last inch till the border with Israel. And when, you know, the UN peacekeeper, you know, UNIFIL trying to say to Hezbollah something, oh, maybe you shouldn't put, you know, according to the UN agreement, you're not supposed to be here, you're not supposed to build missile launches here. They just, you know, shoot them away. They kick them away. They don't even, you know, they don't care about them. So all the land west of the Jordan River has to be under our, you know, Israeli security control. You know, we're talking about 20, 30 miles, you know, that's it, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which is 80% of it is the West Bank. And, you know, every Israeli and Jewish person need to stay where they are. You know, you got many conflicts about territory around the world in Cyprus and, you know, Western Sahara, other places, Kurdistan. Nobody asked for Turkey to, you know, evacuate their Turkish people from North Cyprus for peace agreements in Cyprus. It's unthinkable. So there's no reason that Israel need to, you know, do a war crime against its own people and forcibly kick them out of their homes. Neither did any Palestinian or Arab or Muslim need to leave their home, you know. So every person needs to stay where they are. And, you know, we think that everywhere that you got Jewish presence and Israeli presence need to be under Israeli sovereignty. We're not talking about territories A and B that are, you know, 90 something percent of the Palestinians live in the West Bank, live under their own control, their own autonomy, with their own police, with their own court, with their own flag, with their own, you know, not a single Jew ever dared to enter there. And it's a complete, you know, they have everything they need for their own sovereignty, except of the capability to destroy Israel, which is except of army. That's pretty much it. So, you know, they can call it whatever they want, just as long as they don't have the physical capacity to destroy Israel.
I want to take you to the situation inside Israel. Let's leave the Palestinian issue aside for a second. How do you perceive living in Israel, you know, breathing the political air of the state of Israel? How do you perceive Israeli society today? Are we experiencing the same political polarity as in the United States, or is there still a strong centrist majority?
No, it's completely at the United States. A lot because the left in Israel is pretty much, you know, it comes from the same, you know, it's very synchronized with the left in America. It's the same people like George Soros that funding the radical organizations in America, such as Antifa, you know, and other organization that burning down your streets. It's the same people that, you know, finance the radical Israeli NGOs that's trying to burn down the street, our street. They're not successful of it, but they're trying in the last few months to create anarchy and riots. And you see their flags. They have the flags of Antifa in the last few months in Israel. There's a lot of, you know, sort of riotings from the radical left in Israel. And it's being pumped up by the media the same way, you know, the CNN pumped up the, you know, the left-wing riots in America. And the Israeli media is the same as the American media. It's very radical, very one-sided. You know, it's like, well, it's actually much worse. Think about how much MSNBC and CNN is one-sided. They are really fair and balanced compared to the Israeli media. So you can think about how bad it is in here. And so in the riots of the left in Israel in the last few months, you see the Antifa flag and you see the communist flag. You know, the red flag with the communist symbol here. You know, they're not hiding their intentions, and they're burning Israeli flags. They step on Israeli flags. They are disrespectful for Jewish symbols. For, you know, they're taking off their clothes on top of the menorah and some statues next to the parliament, the Knesset. So, you know, you see it's coming from the same place. It's just an extension of what's happening in America.
And this is not a minority. You're saying these polarities are growing on both sides, and we don't really have a strong middle, a strong centrist in Israel. You're saying everybody's gravitating.
I mean, the radicals in the left, which is, you know, openly communist and anti-Zionist, all of that, they used to be a minority, but it's sort of becoming more and more mainstream in the left, because the media in Israel, this, you know, so-called mainstream media in Israel, are so radical and so, you know, violent and so one-sided that it's just becoming, you know, something that would be unheard of in the Israeli left 10 years ago is now the mainstream and now the norm. So all of the left-wing camp in Israel is, you know, deteriorating and, you know, radicalizing itself.
Is the right in Israel also going more to the right? Do you see a more nationalistic, you know, desires? Is the right also becoming more radical, or the right had stayed where it was?
No, I think the right just stayed, you know, on the original, very basic Zionist principles. And, you know, if the right and the left used to be like this, so the right stayed where it is and the left just kept, you know, going way and way and way to until today. There's hardly any more Zionist left in Israel. There is, but it's becoming almost, you know, the biggest Israeli left-wing party in the parliament is the Arab Muslim Brotherhood Party. That more and more Jews in Israel are voting for this party that is dedicated for the destruction of Israel. It's in their platform, you know, the destruction of Israel, the illegitimacy of a Jewish state. And, you know, it used to be that only the most radical Islamists in Israel vote for them. Now it's becoming like a trend for the left-wing Jews in Israel to vote for them.
So you're describing a very bleak and I'm not going to say pessimistic, but you're describing a real serious situation. So what do we tell young college students facing these anti-Israel, you know, anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Semitic slurs on university campuses? I mean, if in Israel it's happening, if the media in Israel is radicalized and professors are on the left spewing hatred and hostility against Israel, you know, we send our kids, they're young, they're very impressionable, they don't know much about the narrative on either side. What advice can you give a young student starting off his college years on university campuses when they are confronted with so much information or misinformation that could really overwhelm even the best of us? What advice do you have for college students?
Well, I would say just to remember that your professors in university are not God. You know, what they say is not sacred, is not, you know, the 10 Commandments. They could question their professor, they can doubt them. And they need to understand that, sadly, in America and Israel, most of the professors in most universities are very radical, you know, very, very radical, very, you know, the ideology is like AOC on steroids, you know. So they're not objective, you know, mainstream knowledge place. They need to, if they're interested about Israel and about they need to research it themselves, just online, you know, online through social networks, through their friends, and not rely on their professors or, you know, student bodies that usually are very hostile and very radical as well. So, you know, they just need to be curious and educate themselves about this matter, because they're not going to be educated in their universities about this matter. They're going to be indoctrinated.
I want to maybe, you know, change the conversation and take it to a more personal place. First of all, I mean, thank you for the information. Yair, you are really a wellspring of knowledge, and the way you articulate yourself so eloquently, and with a lot of confidence, with a lot of experience.
Thank you so much.
Which I know comes from home. I mean, you've grown in the most incredible home. Your grandfather was, you know, the editor of the
maybe I'll eat it.
Judaica. And, please mute yourself, whoever is unmuted. We're in the middle of a conversation. Let me mute everyone, and then Yair, you unmute yourself. Give me one moment here. Here we go. Just unmute yourself, Yair.
Got it.
All right. So, you know, grew up in a home where you had, you know, your grandfather was a real luminary. I mean, was part of the pioneering spirit of Israel with Jabotinsky and others. And then your father, who is Israel's longest serving prime minister. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu needs no introduction, a great man, a man who achieved tremendous, tremendous things, extremely intelligent, has been able to lead the country into tremendous successes. So my question to you is, what has it meant for you, being the son of Prime Minister Netanyahu, again, one of the most powerful and influential leaders in the world, and the longest serving prime minister in Israel? What has it meant for you growing up with these wonderful parents?
Well, thank you for your kind words. And also, well, it's hard to answer this because I've never experienced anything else. You know, this is the life I know. So, but it's tough. It's very tough, especially because the Israeli media is so vicious and so ruthless. You know, it's so bloodthirsty. And when you're growing up, like almost being hunted since the day you can remember yourself from, you know, these evil people, it's hard. You know, you're seeing, you know, how they are saying horrible things about lies about your parents. And then when I started to grow older, about me, you know, now I'm a fair target too in the last several years. So, you know, it's a tough feeling, but it's rewarding to fight back. And this is why I opened up a Twitter account and Facebook account and Instagram, etc. Because I figured out they're gonna, you know, talk bad things about me anyway. I might as well, you know, fight back and get my voice out and get my truth out, you know. So this is why I started to become so active on social media. And regarding the a lot of you said before about my grandfather, about the father of my father, and not a lot of people know that he was an advisor of Jabotinsky, which is the, you know, the conservative leader, you know, legendary leader of Israel. And he was based back then in London because Israel was part of the British Empire. So of course the Zionist advocation, the, you know, the common wisdom was that it's need to be the lobbying for the Zionist cause need to be in London vis-a-vis the British. And my grandfather told Jabotinsky, you need to move to New York, you need to move to America, because Britain is, you know, going is a declining power, and America is the rising power, and America is the place where, you know, the future world center is, and you need to persuade the public opinion in America. And my grandfather was very active in persuading the public opinion in America towards Zionism. And he was actually one of the people who was responsible for the Republican Party to put inside their platform. I'm not sure what decade it was. I think it was the 1940s, but I'm not sure. That they put for the first time in their platform a support for a Jewish state in the land of Israel, thanks to his advocacy. And then shortly after, the Democrat Party adopted this resolution as well. So, you know, this is something that not a lot of people know. So
there's no question here you have big shoes to fill, a lot of responsibility and a lot of incredible things that you've seen and heard in your home. And my final question to you is, you know, being privy to such amazing parents and grandparents. What is the most important lesson your father and mother have taught you? If you can, in one line or in a couple of words, share with us the most important lesson, life lesson that you've learned growing up in the Netanyahu household.
Well, I guess if you sum it up to a bottom line, so the love for my country, the love for my people, the love for my land, just to be connected to my roots and to our people's roots.
Yair Netanyahu, thank you very, very much for your time. You've inspired us all. I would like to give...
Thank you so much, Ara.
No, Toda Rabba. It was really oneg haya shelanu.
And thank you so much for Tila for making this happen and putting so much effort for this.
A couple of concluding words, Tila, go ahead.
Yair, I am so proud of you. I hear you speak all the time in a private setting, not so much in a public setting. And really, you amaze me every time, your knowledge and your love and your passion. And I just want to say that one thing that you didn't say, because you're not going to say, is when he said, what's it like to grow up in your household? I can tell you that I've had a glimpse into your private family life when we share our birthdays every summer. And your parents are so proud of you. Your father looks at you with such admiration and he loves everything that you do. And your mother always looks at you and says that you're so smart and you're so brilliant. And she's right. I'm just happy that I got to share that with my community in Miami. And I'm so happy that I got to share it with this program because you're amazing. So thank you for all that you do. Continue to fight for Am Yisrael and lechazek the Netanyahu family because you're part of the most amazing family that we've had in history. You are our royalty. You are our prince. And I hope that you should be healthy and live a long life and keep doing what you do because you're doing it great.
Thank you so much, Sheila. It was my pleasure.
יאיר, תודה רבה על הכל, תודה על המילים, תודה על החיוך המדהים, ותשמור על עצמך ותשמור על עם ישראל. שיהיה לך לילה טוב.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I remind everybody that our next session is our Israel advocacy course happening tomorrow evening at 7. I sent out 7:30, but a correction. It's at 7 p.m. The topics are anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Arab conflict. It's a more in-depth look at everything that you've heard in the last 4 sessions. The speaker is going to be Rebecca Herman, and I will introduce her formally tomorrow. She will be discussing these topics, again, in great depth. Stay tuned. It's going to be very interesting. It's a 4-part course. And I hope that we can grow this group and be able to launch a full course of many, many more sessions. But once again, November 2nd, via Zoom, 7 p.m., Rebecca Herman will be the speaker. The topic is an in-depth look at anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Arab conflict. On behalf of my entire team, Tila Falik, Rebecca Herman, Avner Yeshurin, Mendy Bandel, Michelle Bandel, and our Shlicha from Israel, Tamar Columbus. I wish you all a good evening. Thank you for joining us.